Hi, I'm James Barron. It's my distinct pleasure today to welcome Karen Wilkin to a Zoom conversation on Kikuo Saito in conjunction with our exhibition, Paint with Drawing. Karen is a friend since 1980. We met just about the same time that I met Kikuo Saito, who had come into Knoedler, look with such intensity at the shows and with such a wry, kind of self-deprecating type of humor. He's very distinct in both of our lives, much more in Karen's than mine. They were dear personal friends. They went to the opera and theater together. Karen invited him to her home for holidays. By way of introduction, Karen is an independent curator and critic. She's done exhibitions and monographs on Hans Hofmann, Anthony Caro, David Smith, Giorgio Morandi, Helen Frankenthaler, and she writes for the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, the Hudson Review. She's a teacher at the New York Studio School. So Karen, welcome.
Thank you, James. Happy to be here.
Great. So Maria, let's look at and I'd also like to thank my staff, Maria Klemus and Rebecca Lee, Hasey Cross, Dylan Everett for their efforts on this presentation. How about this for a quote, Karen? I always wanted to paint with drawing.
Well, as you know, Kikuo's English was interesting. I mean, he read the New York Times cover to cover every single day. I mean, it was not that he didn't understand English, but I always thought we somehow communicated on some kind of Zen level. I think we had long and deep conversations about things, but I think they may have been done with thought exchange.
Next slide, Maria.
But it's certainly borne out by his work. Although, as you know, Kikuo started out in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
He came to the United States at the age of 26 from Japan in 1966, and he had incredible carpentry skills. I think he actually was working as a carpenter with his friend Nakanami, who came with him at the same time. And he was building beautiful furniture all his life. I lived with a magnificent chair. But he was working in theater. He was working with Vanguard Dance in Japan. And when he first came to the United States, that's what he was doing. Immediately started working with Ellen Stewart at La Mama, mm-hmm. who I think he stayed on the board of La Mama all his life. I think we have some more slides of
yeah. And also, why do you think he came to New York in the first place?
Well, you know, being born in 1939 in Japan, in Tokyo, mm-hmm. Exactly the best time to be in Japan. And he wanted something larger. His brother, who stayed in Japan, makes absolutely beautiful high-end hand-built furniture. So there was that kind of commonality. His brother's English is actually better than his.
Amazing. So what are we looking at here?
Well, these are some of the things he did with La Mama, and it gives you some sense of relationship between drawing and what happened in the theater, and then this extraordinary imagination of what could happen on a stage. Animals, water. He started working with Peter Brook. He started working with Robert Wilson, who was always trying to get him to come back. Mm-hmm. I mean, to Kikuo's dying day, he said, "Yeah, Bob wants me to come to Long Island."
Wow.
And a lot of things that we think of as being characteristic of Peter Brook productions, like the water on stage, that was Kikuo.
See, now that's amazing to me. And I'm thinking about that when we see more slides of the paintings, about the incidents in theater and the incidents in the paintings. Maria, could we see the next, please? There we go.
There's Ellen Stewart,
mm-hmm.
Who used to describe herself as Kikuo Saito's American mother. And a more unlikely pair you could not imagine. Each other.
See the next, please.
And of course, Kiko immediately started working with artists.
Mm-hmm.
He got very disenchanted with the world of performance, even though Jerome Robbins was a big fan. As I say, Peter Brook, Robert Wilson, La Mama depended on him. He didn't like the collaboration. He wanted to work by himself. Even though the theater is where he met his first wife, who was a dancer and choreographer, also a great friend of mine named Eva Meyer, and who died tragically young of a brain aneurysm. But there were collaborations with Eva, but he didn't want to work with these other people anymore. He was much happier in the studio and then working as a painter's assistant. When I first met him, he was Kenneth Nolan's assistant. Here, Ken with Clement Greenberg, who of course championed his work. The kind of work that Ken was doing at the time, can you have the next slide, please? Were these shaped canvases.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband and I were visiting Ken's studio at that point he was in Shaftesbury, Vermont. And there was Kiko crouched on the floor on what appeared to be a space about, the size of that, with Stuart Walzer, who was an American assistant who was not on a space that small. And they were being directed by Ken, who was on top of a ladder with an ashtray and a cigarette, so he didn't have to come down. They were moving big sheets of brown paper to create the edges of these shaped canvases, which of course were on rectangular sheets of canvas. So that was the first time I met him. And then subsequently, Bill O'Reilly, who had a wonderful gallery at the time, and who showed Kiko, had given him his first New York exhibition, I think the year before. Actually gave him two exhibitions, one at the beginning of the year, one at the end of the year. Bill took me to Kiko's studio, and I'm doing that ever since.
Karen, both of us obviously follow Italian art, early Renaissance art very closely, Baroque. It really intrigues me, though, that in America, in New York, there's this possibility for a young artist to serve as assistant for Larry Poons, Kenneth Nolan, and Helen Frankenthaler, and then to glean something from it. I mean, do you see the relationship between, let's say, even Filippo Lippi and Filippino Lippi and this, connection that we see and New York artists?
I think it's very much the same thing. Could we keep moving the slides ahead, please? The next slide.
There we go.
These were obviously of different generations. Helen was considerably older than Larry, although younger than Ken Nolan or Drew Zalitsky, or much younger than Morris Louis, any of the people that she influenced so profoundly. But I think from these artists, from being exposed to their work, to being in their studios, I don't think it's so much influence as confirmation of what Kiko wanted to do. Obviously, he learned from them. Art is about other art, whatever else it's about.
Well, and there might have been a cross reference also, because he had such a distinct energy. And let's be honest, he was in those studios at some breakthrough moments in their careers.
Yeah, and they remained friends, and they, visited each other's studios. So it's not that it was just, I work for these people and I've learned from what I saw in the studio. He's very much part of this community.
Right.
At all the openings, at all the parties.
Well, this is a view of our exhibition in the gallery right now. One wall, the central wall. And we'll keep going and we'll be getting to these paintings, but this is a painting.
What's very important about that shot we just left is the differences among these paintings, because Kiko didn't have one way of making a painting.
Right.
over the years, he would follow the implications of things and see where they take them. What did remain consistent, and you and I have talked about this a good deal, is the rich variety of ways that he put on paint.
Mm-hmm. You know, Karen, I'm intrigued how you would leave spaces open. It took me, you know, every day that I see the show, it enriches my knowledge of his work. And actually, to be really frank, I think that partly due to Kikuo Saito, the genius of, you know, Kiko for having set this up, I think we're really expanding our knowledge on Saito's work in a way that's pretty distinct for this moment. I look at how he left an open space and then he fills it in the order of the paints. There's kind of a heavy paint, this kind of taupey paint. He leaves it open and he comes in with these colors, and you can actually spend hours just looking at the order of how the paints go on. And that in terms of performance and theater seems interesting to me.
That's a very good point. And each of those bars of color is put on with a different kind of gesture. It's not just that it's a different color. The green is more transparent. The blue is more fluid and soaked in. The red is more controlled and linear. Then you have the spotting. So the theater analogy is very good because these are like the performers in a wordless drama. And I think wordless is key. Kiko adored no plays. He adored kabuki. Whenever a troupe came to New York, he and Eva and my husband and I would all go, and we can continue to do that with him. So the things he staged wasn't just doing the sets. He was staging things, and sometimes with Eva's choreography. So he had this peripheral connection, even when he stopped working full time with the people that he worked with before. And I think your point is very interesting in that the way he's putting together the painting he's still the same person. It's not, it's not going to get lost somewhere.
Karen, one thing that I sense in the work is an innocence and a glee. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit as a person and also in the work.
He loved painting.
Yeah.
That's what he wanted to do more than anything. I think we have another slide that gives you even more sense of the surface. Yeah, there we are.
I mean,
look at the differences in even within the same color. And then he goes in and slashes it with the end of the brush to give you another kind of drawing.
And it's like this, intriguing thing about painting and drawing. I mean, how does he make that mark with the butt end of the brush? It feels very much like drawing to me.
It is like drawing. I mean, it's interesting. The edges all have to function like drawing,
Yeah. So this is another view of the two paintings. Of course, the one on the left is one of the later works, which we'll get to in a minute. Next, please.
Calligraphic.
Yeah.
I should point out, and I think this is extremely important, that even though, as we'll see, letters become part of Kiko's drawing vocabulary, he never does anything that looks like Japanese calligraphy, ever. We need to talk about that.
That is really interesting. And even when you're talking about letters, this painting, which is directly behind me on the left, which we literally unpacked about an hour ago, this painting came from Edmonton, Alberta, far away. It's thrilling for me to see this painting. When I'm looking at it right now, it looks almost like an A that divides up twice, or, there's something about starting with letters, which I think is really fundamental to his work. Karen, also in this painting, he's really written very large. He's taking his arm and he's swiping it down twice and then across. I mean, I look at it and I think about a Robert Motherwell open painting, but it's so distinctly Kikuo Saito. It has nothing to do with Robert Motherwell.
Well, he was certainly aware what his predecessors, who were very much alive and working, and his own generation were doing. I mean, he was part of the conversation.
Karen, can you talk a little bit about elements appearing and disappearing in the work? You know, I'm looking in particular at these two little apertures where he leaves an opening, he puts in a purple mark, he puts something, you search for it, your eye almost loses it. Do you know the point I'm trying to make?
I do, and I see the area you're talking about too. I think there are two things that are sound contradictory. One is wide variety in the way Kikuo put a picture together. He didn't have a single way of doing it, and he could be influenced. Could we have the next one, please? There are family resemblances among these. These are within a relatively short period of 3 years, but they're not the same. And it's as though, as I say, he had this cast of characters, this repertory company that he was deploying, or maybe more accurate to say a company of dancers.
Oh, I just love that so much, Karen. I think it is so brilliant. I mean, when you think about his paintings, the type of stage with recurring characters, recurring even more than themes, they seem so familiar. And he seems to take such glee. I hate to use that word again, but I really feel it, like the glee between a purple and a blue like that. Elation.
As I say, that's essentially all he really wanted to do. And read the New York Times. But he was passionate about this.
I mean, you look at a painting like this and you're starting to realize this guy's a lot greater than we thought he was. Most of us out here, I mean, this painting stands up against any of the people we've been talking about, which is quite a remarkable achievement. So we're in '79. Here's a piece which is in a museum in Belfast. God, how amazing.
Not there, but
Karen, I was talking yesterday with you, these marks, these three marks in the kind of middle upper left, they feel almost like collage, like paper that's just kind of tacked on.
I'm pretty sure they're paint.
Oh, they're paint, but it's like an illusion almost to paper, like things that have been moved around.
He was around people who were working in all kinds of ways. He did a lot of work on paper, some very beautiful work on paper, and he did some cast paper as well, which really started with Tyler Graphics, which used to have a big enterprise in Mount Kisco until they sold the plant, and which is now I think, Mercedes showroom. But Kenneth Nolan got really interested in cast paper and had his own setup in his studio. And I think when Kikuo did the cast paper, he was doing it at Katz. So I keep saying he was part of the conversation, but he had his own language.
Right. Next slide, please.
So he worked in different things. This is a screen print, and he certainly was aware of Motherwell's very large body of work on paper, both graphic and drawing on paper.
But it's interesting because for Motherwell, this is a little bit of a side note, and for Saito, it's something that goes through the work. It's a through thread.
Motherwell was a printmaker all his life. And this lyric suite started when he bought 100 sheets of Japanese paper and decided he was going to do something on each sheet. He never finished it because while he was in the middle of it, I don't know how many he had gotten to, that was when David Smith was killed in an automobile accident, and he never went back to it. But Motherwell did some of his best work on paper. Some of his best work was collage, which Kikuo did not do. But that same variety of personable marks is in Kikuo's print as well.
Motherwell studied philosophy, but I do wonder, did you and Kikuo ever talk about philosophy? Did he read philosophy much?
That wasn't the kind of conversation you could have with him.
Please.
It was, he was very, very intelligent,
Right.
thoughtful guy. But that wasn't the kind of conversation you had with him.
Well, here's a moment, 1980, 78, 79, 80. Can you talk about this show, which was hugely important at the time?
This was what was supposed to be the beginning of an annual event when a curator was going to choose a group of current, in this case, it was all painters, and shown at Andre Emmerich Gallery, which, as you know, was one of the top galleries at the time. The curator who did the first selection was Kenworth Moffat, who was a rising, incredibly smart guy who had been teaching at Wellesley, went to work at the Boston MFA when they established a Department of Contemporary Art for him. And so he made the selection. And it was a very interesting group of painters that included a lot of people from New York. There's Kikuo, who was the middle painting in the left-hand column, was a Canadian painter called Paul Fournier, who's underneath Kikuo, Darrell Hutto above him, John Greep to the right, and there also was a German painter. It was a very, very interesting cross-section. Unfortunately, there was never a second version of this or any further version of it. But it was very important for Kikuo to be included in this. I think there were 12 painters in it altogether.
Yeah, and Ken was hugely influential as a museum curator, having done also the Fairfield Porter show at the MFA and many other shows.
One Netherwell collage show. He did Tim Scott sculpture. He did Jack Bush, a superb Canadian painter who was much better known in the United States than he was in Canada, who was a brilliant, brilliant colorist and someone who, of course, Kikuo was very aware of also.
Next slide, please. Oh, there we are.
So here's Ken Moffat with Ken Noland, and probably taken the same day that other photograph was taken.
Next, please.
So these very, very distinctive paintings that are very much part of, as I keep saying, part of the conversation of the time, but don't look like anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And the 80s paintings tend to have these open areas and these drawing like pieces of color. They, over the years, of course, they changed and became even more painting became even more constructed with drawing. And I think part of that had to do with a major theater piece that he worked on. We have the next slide, please.
And Karen, also, could you talk a little bit, that painting, Azalea, which, oh my God, this is like so stunning. It's oil on canvas as opposed to acrylic, which he used somewhat later. Did you talk to him about that change and why he decided to do that?
Everybody was experimenting with acrylic, especially if you wanted to use large areas of color. I mean, that's what really started it, because if you want a large area of color with oil paint, you have to thin it out. And then it loses its intensity and its brilliance. And people started using acrylic which was a commercial plastic paint, and really didn't do very much with the early acrylic, because it could cover a very large area, to be thin enough and fluid enough to do that without losing intensity. Golden's paint, which was started by Sam Golden, who'd been a chemist at Beaucourt, which was the paint company. Sam Golden retired to the country, to New Berlin, New York, which is west of Cooperstown, which is more or less the middle of nowhere. And the only other thing there, which is a recent addition, is the Chobani Yogurt Factory, 1 mile up the road. The Thad got bored, so he started his own paint company. And Golden's Paint is now the state-of-the-art company because they've been it was run then by Sam's son, Mark, and now it is owned entirely by the employees, but it is still a state-of-the-art experimental paint company where they work closely with artists. Artists would say, I really like this medium, but I want it thicker. And they now have an oil paint line as well. But they were working closely with artists. They would send artists something they'd cooked up and said, well, see what this does. Do you like it? Or as I say, the artist would ask for something. So everybody, this, was a very much smaller art world at that time. Pretty much everybody in New York knew each other. And they were trying things out together. And they were experimental. So, I have this gel and it's really thick and I really like it. So what was going on technically was also part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please.
That's one of the handmade paper pieces. And you can see how even within a brief period, the painting on the bottom is more or less the same time as the one we just looked at. And it's almost like turning the other one inside out. Instead of leaving the spaces open, you fill them in with color. So he was always responding to the implications of what he was doing and seeing what else he could do.
I'm intrigued with his titles. Regatta Night, when you look at the painting that's in the Ringling in Sarasota, it's an interesting title. Without that title, to me, it's almost topographical, like I'm looking down at something, an aerial view, and then it becomes looking at a seascape at night.
Well, those triangular shapes become sails.
Right.
And that's what triggered it.
But also what a beautiful notion of sailing at night, the idea of navigation, of wind at night. Next slide, please. Very poetic, and I think there's a poetic element to his work, which we have to explore. So
when I say he's part of the conversation, I mean these are works by Jack Bush,
right,
who was showing at Emmerich Gallery, who, as I say, was much better known than as a in New York than he was in Canada.
So this is another painting in our show called Silver Camel. Next slide, please. I think we have a detail of it.
I mean about let's see what happens if I do this. If I don't leave the white areas, if I draw, keep the drawing to the end of the brush, if the color becomes smaller, it's I say, following implications, and with the same sense of slow speed that informed all of his theater work.
Karen, how about this? Having just seen Regatta Night, it's kind of interesting to think of the two side by side. It'd be a fascinating comparison.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So this is just to give us an idea of kind of the topography of the canvas, where these marks are set and you actually feel the contour of the paint. So you feel his arm go like this or like that. So you start thinking about the direction of his arm.
The other thing he was always very aware of was having the energy and a kind of roughness in the work. He would worry that something was too shibui, which is one of the 3 Japanese words I know, which means too elegant, too finished.
I like that.
He didn't want that.
Next, please. Another view in the gallery. I couldn't resist putting in some branches just because There is just something so poetic about these paintings. Next, please.
So once he got interested in a kind of all over, a more all over kind of painting, he explored those implications. And of course, at the same time, the acrylic technology is changing, so you can get a more varied and inflected surface. You couldn't have done this with the first version of our acrylic, responding to what painters wanted. And he's exploring what it can do.
Karen, I'm curious, did he ever express any curiosity or even bitterness about the fact that many of the people that he knew were becoming greater luminaries and he was sort of hovering in the shadow a little bit, or was that a place he was happy to be?
Kiko was always happy to be in the shadow. He would, you know, at the parties, he could be very affable, but he also could sneak out for a cigarette and not come back. But he did have an incredible connection with anybody who came in contact with him. William Noland, Bill Noland's son, who is a wonderful sculptor and photographer and video artist, just retired from teaching at Duke. And Duke has a program of sending interns to New York. So Kiko had a lot of people come to work with him from Duke and inspired the most extraordinary devotion and loyalty from all of them. He remained in touch with them. We'll be talking more about that when we talk about Kikuo Saito. But he had this ability to connect with people that was truly remarkable.
Next slide, please. Another great one.
This is the beginning of the theater paintings. The production at Duke called Toy Garden, which was, he was invited to come with Eva Meyer and work with the dance department, the theater department, and the art department. And this was a performance called Toy Garden, which was inspired by, could we have next slide, please? Well, we'll keep going. Inspired by this painting, which is in the Museo Curator in Venice. It's a painting in which half is missing, this dog who's been cut off. They recently, maybe 10 years ago, found the top of it, which is a view of people fishing in the lagoon, but they've never found this side. And so this became, the Toy Garden was about Ruskin in Venice, hence the background which said Venezia, Venice. And there was a wonderful character in it who was a dancer costumed as an iguana going across the stage on a dolly, because Kiko thought this head of this dog looked like an iguana. These paintings came out of working drawings for the performance, where each of these would look like abstract gestures turn out to be inspired by characters in the performance. There was a woman with a bird cage skirt, well, which is what this comes out of. And there are other things that you can identify if you know the history, but it works as a totally abstract painting about drawing and gesture. Out of that came a lot of paintings. These are sketches for this backdrop, in which he was using the big Roman letters. And they persisted, but got caught up with the other kinds of gestures. And they made me think about what was going on when Kiko arrived in America, age 26, with minimal English. And here's a whole new, not only new language, but a new alphabet.
Mm-hmm. Next, please. I would imagine being at a crosswalk and just seeing walk, don't walk would have been an endlessly fascinating thing for him.
And you see how these letters appear in different ways with other kinds of gestures.
Next, please.
Sometimes the gestures overwhelm. You and I were talking about Yanis Cornelis, who did these sort of language number paintings. And he, like Kikuo, arrived from a place where he had a different alphabet. He came as quite a mature person from Greece to Italy. So he had the same transformation of alphabet signs to contend with.
And of course, with Cornelis, just to be in Rome and to see all these Roman numerals carved into antique buildings. Can you imagine, you know, what it was like? Next, please. Well, here's a painting in our show called Copper Moon. Wow, what an intriguing title, by the way. Do you know how he came up with these titles?
As I say, Kiko's connection to language was always fascinating.
Copper Moon, how poetic, though. I love it.
Yeah.
Next, please.
I mean,
you get into how the brush is moving here, and it seems so performative. I think it's important to note for those who had not met him, I have no idea what he weighed, but this is a very sprightly, you know, he looked like he could have been a contortionist almost. He was so light on his feet. And I could imagine him dancing across the canvas on the ground, on the floor, and just moving his brush like this.
He was, as I say, he could crouch on a dime. and he liked crouching. He spent a lot of time crouching. But the energy in these paintings, I mean, you can see where they come from. One thing dominates more in a painting than another at different times, sometimes geometry, sometimes calligraphy. And the last paintings tend to be the most energetic and calligraphic in a totally abstract way. But look at that color.
Yeah.
You can't name any one of those colors.
Right. Right. And, you know, there's an interesting point about how he would refer back to his earlier work. Some of these look vaguely like the shapes in the cloud paintings, his very first series, 18 paintings. Yeah. I mean, this shape in the middle looks like a cloud to me. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please.
And of course, he's totally in love with Matisse.
Right.
Very aware of that as a president. And finding a way of assimilating that and making it his own.
I was intrigued when we were looking at Azalea painting a while back. There was one of the rectangles, there were 4 rectangles in the slide, and he bridged from this kind of periwinkle blue to the white raw canvas, just as Matisse is bridging spaces with, you know, his brush. But Saito made everything his own.
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, he learned from the best. This was a quite late painting, and you could see how they could be as dense as Copper Moon or as open as a Cuenca.
You know, it's interesting also that even though he had all this work in the theater and with performance, this is still a human scale at 65 by 44 inches. Yeah. I mean, it's roughly almost like the size of him, probably with his arms out. Yeah. I find that really interesting that he never went huge. He didn't do a 30-foot, you know, 15-foot by 30-foot painting.
Part of that was the size of his studio.
There we go.
I don't think he was interested in that kind of bombastic monumentality.
I mean, and also we should really point out what a humble man he was. I had an instance in Italy where I was having a glass of wine and an artist came up to me and said, "You know, I'm just curious, how many chateaus did Picasso have?" And I said, "I'd have to count. Why?" And he said, "I'd like to have the same number." I thought, wow, man, this is gonna be a rough life you're gonna be in for if you think you're Picasso. Good luck. Next slide, please. But Saito was very much the opposite of that. The humility. And what a great quote. Repetition can be very important, but it has to mean something different every time.
And that's certainly true in his paintings, even if repeating a gesture. And that was always true in any of the performance pieces he did. After Toy Garden, he did another one with the students at LaGuardia High School, which he said was very difficult to get them to move very slowly.
Right.
what he wanted.
Slide, please.
Yeah.
There is the studio. Next slide, please. Well, on the porch. This must be very bittersweet for you to see something like that. I can imagine you just being on the porch with him.
Yeah, that was his first wife's family place in Cape May.
Amazing.
They
Next
were
slide.
married
With
now.
binoculars.
And as you see, I mean, the studio was ample, but not immense. And it had an awful lot of stuff in it, you know, a lot of.
Next, please. Yeah, I really would like to tip the cap at Mikiko. Kikuo Saito, Karen, I want you to go into the history, but I do have to say, I'm trying to think of a partner of an artist who has done a more magnificent job in really helping us to understand the breadth and scope of the work of an artist. And I can't think of one. So I'm just in awe of what they're doing up there. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the building and how this came about?
Kiko's fabulous, lovely second wife, Mikiko Ino, who has a background in fashion marketing, so she's very much part of the real world. Kiko and Mikiko decided to buy a place out of the city where they could store his work safely. He had had some flood damage, and it would also be a weekend retreat for them. And they found in Verplank, which is a really interesting little town on an inlet on the Hudson. It's where George Washington had his winter headquarters, but that's another story. They found this complex of 3 buildings, which had last been used as a school. There was a 19th century or early 20th century farmhouse. There was another building, which is off to the left of this, which was a fairly recent, very secure building. And there was this, which had been a Masonic hall and became part of the school. And Mikiko had done this incredible job. After Kiko died, she decided, all right, it's not going to be his studio anymore, but it will still be storage. And she's going to turn it into an art center, which she has succeeded in doing. And with the full support of the town, which has been very, very interested in what she's been doing, she has the secure building for storage. In this building, there are 2 residency studios, which are fabulous with gorgeous windows and little living balconies and kitchens. There is a performance space, which is sometimes used as an additional exhibition space. There are 2 galleries, one of which always is devoted to Kiko's work, and the other is visiting artists. There's a room that honors the history of the school. And when they had their grand opening, which I think was 2 years ago, when I was there, people were walking in and saying, oh, I haven't been here since I was in the 4th grade. So people who had gone to school there. It's just terrific and full of energy. There's an espresso bar, which Mikiko has been manning. If there's any barista who wants a job, she's looking for one. Can we go on to the next slide? These are the movers and shakers. This is the board. Sarah Strauss was one of Kiko's interns from Duke. He convinced her, he was astute enough to realize she really wanted to be an architect. She became an architect. She is a successful architect, and she was the architect who supervised the renovation of this building, which is beautifully done. That's Mikiko Ino in the center, and Joshua Cohen, who just won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction.
Bravo for that. Wow.
Who was Eva Meyer's cousin and became very close to Kiko and has remained very involved. But all sorts of people who were his former, Kiko's former interns came and helped physically do the project.
Wow. Next slide, please.
It's just been amazing. This is the gallery with the opening show, which was theater paintings. There's the iguana. scene end on. You don't get his full length. And so that's one of the galleries.
Next, please.
And this is the current, or I think it just came down. No, it did come down. This is the show in the other gallery, which actually I curated, which is of the painter Fran O'Neill and the sculptor Ghislaine Jones. So there will always be this interchange, and it's often an installation from one of the artists with a residency in the big space, which is also used for performance.
Incredible. Next slide, please. This is a show that we had done a couple of years back, which had featured the late paintings, including an alphabet painting. This was a really dramatic and stunning exhibition. Next, please. Yeah, Silver Dust. Wow. And you can see the letters here, especially along the bottom. Yeah. I'm so intrigued. You know, you've got an empty canvas. What do? You know, you kind of infiltrate it. You dirty it up with some letters, then you go from there. It's fascinating. And de Kooning did the same thing.
Yeah.
Next, please.
A way of getting started, and also a way of tying it to something else. Yeah. But as you see, I mean, within very much the same period, you'll be pushing one extreme or the other.
This is another example of works we exhibited in the gallery. Next, please. And this is for those of you who haven't visited, which is most people, this is what the gallery looks like on a misty morning. I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions for Karen, and Rebecca and Maria could read them off or bring them here. And if not, Karen, I'm wondering, is there anything that you'd like to add to the conversation that we haven't covered, or should I muster up another question?
Well, why don't you muster a question while I think?
Okay. Yeah, this is a quote from Cornelis that I've written down. My early paintings, those with letters and numbers, were also phonetic and therefore profoundly musical. Now that's an idea I'd hope to get at because of the theater and because his work feels sort of musical to me. Is that something you've ever talked to him about?
Well, he certainly listened to a lot of music. He was certainly someone who was very, I believe he had music on when he worked.
What did he listen to?
Mostly classical.
Huh, wow.
Now that may just have been in deference to me because I was not very up on other things. But we certainly went to, his dance programs that Robert Wilson working with Philip Glass, for example.
I'd like to point out also that Dakota Sika and Leslie Feely had shown his work quite successfully, and now James Fuentes is doing a magnificent job. They published a book, which I absolutely adore. I've read it cover to cover a few times. And there's a quote from Hal Foster. For those of you who haven't seen the book, there may be 7 or 8 essays by very distinguished people. Hal Foster says, how does an image appear and can it be made to disappear at the same time, or better, coax to linger in a limbo between these two states? I mean, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that seems very pertinent. Okay, Rebecca has asked a question here, which is, does Karen have a favorite period of his work?
It tends to be whichever ones I'm standing in front of. But I'm fortunate enough to live with one of the theater paintings, which I've had for a long time and really holds up. But that is my favorite period.
I feel the same thing. Every time I'm seeing them, I love them all more. I thought maybe we'd close with a quote that you could react to. This is Kikuo Saito saying, America made me an artist.
Well, you've heard the history. He came as a 26-year-old with a background in theater, dance, and fantastic carpentry skills. That's not what we remember him for.
Right. I suppose in closing, I'd like to say at this moment where all of us are distraught at what's going on in our country and our world, what an emblem he is to me of what can happen when somebody comes over to our country in 1966 with a passport that says artist, and how you can forge a life, how you could find yourself somehow in La Mama, and then as an assistant to Kenneth Noland, Helen Frankenthaler, Larry Poons, and to find a language that's so distinctly his own that it's touched many people. Karen, I'd like to thank you not only for today's talk, but for what I know was a lifetime of friendship and feedback. And every artist who comes over to America needs someone like you who could be honest and forthright. And we've known each other now for 42 years. And I don't think you've ever minced a word, ever. And I know that that was really important to Kikuo Saito. So thank you for today and for what you did for his work.
Well, thank you. I learned a lot in Kikuo's studio. And I have to thank Bill O'Reilly, who not only the first person to be perceptive enough to show his work, but remained a valued studio presence for him all his life. And who, as I say, is the person who introduced me to Kikuo's studio. So I'm very grateful to him too.
Well, Bill's a remarkable guy. I've also known him for many decades, and his eye is unerring, and we appreciate that. So Karen, thank you once again. And for those of you who joined us, we appreciate you having been here today. Thank you.
Thank you.